What happens when one of Africa's poorest nations begins asking a dangerous economic question? What if we stop measuring progress by how much aid arrives and start measuring it by how much we can produce, process, and sell? That question is now hanging over Burkina Faso at sunrise, far from the ministries of Ouagadougou. A farmer walks across dry soil, knowing that one season can decide whether his family moves forward or falls behind. Fertilizer costs matter, rainfall matters, roads matter, but something else now matters too: whether Burkina Faso can turn agriculture from survival into leverage. Under Ibrahim Traore, the government has pushed harder on food production, irrigation, agricultural equipment, and the idea of greater economic self-reliance. But this story is not about pretending aid disappeared overnight. It is about a deeper shift in ambition. If this story matters to you, tell us where you are watching from, because the decision Burkina Faso is testing may reach far beyond its borders. Here is the real problem. Growing more food is only step one. A nation can harvest more rice, maize, wheat, or mangoes and still remain economically weak if others control processing, transport, financing, and final markets. Later in this video, we will examine the one part of Traore's strategy that could determine whether trade over aid becomes real policy or just a powerful slogan. Because Burkina Faso's biggest agricultural battle may not be fought in the field at all. It may begin after the harvest. Before Burkina Faso can talk seriously about trade, it has to answer a more basic question: can it produce more of what its own people need? That is why the agricultural push matters. The government's 2023 to 2025 agropastoral and fisheries offensive focused on strategic products such as rice, maize, wheat, potatoes, fish, livestock, poultry, and mangoes. On paper, that sounds like a list. In real life, it is a map of vulnerability. Every bag of food imported because local production falls short represents money leaving the domestic economy. Every harvest produced locally can support not only a farmer, but also a transporter, a mechanic, a storage operator, a trader, and eventually a processor. That is the first economic shift Burkina Faso is trying to create. Picture a farmer in the countryside before sunrise. For years, he may have measured success by a simple standard. Did the rains come? Did the crop survive? And was there enough left after harvest to carry the family through another season? Now introduce machinery, improved inputs, pumps, irrigation, and a better access to cultivated land, and the calculation begins to change. A tractor is not just a government photograph. To a farmer, it means more hectares worked in less time. A pump is not just equipment, it can mean another planting cycle. Irrigation is not a speech. It means reducing the power that uncertain rainfall holds over a family's future. This is why investments in agricultural equipment and irrigated zones matter more than the ceremony surrounding them. They are an attempt to convert farming from endurance into productivity. One example is the expansion of irrigated development in the Mohun Valley, where projects such as the Niegema-Tukoro perimeter fit into a broader effort to bring more land under controlled water access. But this is where the story becomes more difficult because machines do not create prosperity by themselves. A government can buy tractors, but it cannot command the weather. It can expand irrigation, but it cannot guarantee every farmer will have affordable fuel, spare parts, fertilizer, storage, or a buyer waiting at harvest. It can raise production, but it cannot simply order markets to become profitable. That is why Burkina Faso's agricultural transformation should not be judged only by how many machines are delivered or how many hectares are announced. The real test is whether productivity rises enough to create reliable income. And that creates a deeper question. If a nation plants more but cannot move the harvest efficiently, store it safely, process it competitively, and sell it at a price that rewards the producer, has it really gained economic independence? This is the point where the phrase food sovereignty begins to change meaning. At first, it sounds defensive. Grow more at home, import less, reduce vulnerability. But a country does not become stronger economically only by buying less from others. At some point, it must also create something others want to buy from it. That is the turning point Ibrahim Traore's government is moving toward, whether the policy succeeds fully or not. Burkina Faso must first prove it can grow more, then it must prove that extra production does not become wasted potential. Because once the harvest begins to rise, a much harder question appears. Who captures the value after the food leaves the farm? And that is where Burkina Faso's agricultural revolution either becomes an economic revolution or stops at the edge of the field. The first revolution happens in the field. The second begins after the harvest. Imagine a mango grown in Burkina Faso. At the farm gate, its value is limited. But once that mango is cleaned, preserved, packaged, branded, transported, and sold in another market, its value can rise again and again. The farmer creates the raw product, but much of the final profit may be captured later in the chain. That is the economic problem Burkina Faso now has to confront. Producing more food is important, but producing more does not automatically mean keeping more wealth inside the country. This is where agriculture becomes industry. The deeper question is no longer simply, can Burkina Faso grow enough? It becomes, how much of the value created from that harvest can remain in Burkina Faso? Think about what happens when a crop leaves the farm. Someone stores it, someone grades it, someone processes it, someone packages it, someone moves it by truck, someone finances the shipment, someone sells it wholesale, someone finally places it in front of the customer. Each step creates income. Each step creates employment. Each step creates another point where value can either remain inside the country or leave it. This is why local processing matters so much in the larger vision behind economic self-reliance. A nation that exports only raw products may produce more and still remain stuck near the bottom of the value chain. But a nation that can process part of what it grows begins to create a different kind of economy. Now picture a young Burkinabe worker in Ouagadougou or Bobo Dioulasso deciding what his future looks like. A farm may offer seasonal work, but a functioning agricultural value chain can create many different jobs around that farm. machinery repair, warehousing, food processing, packaging, quality control, trucking, accounting, distribution, sales, export services. Suddenly, agriculture is no longer only about rural survival. It becomes a platform for industrial activity. That is the real economic opportunity hidden behind the tractors and irrigation pumps. And this is where Ibrahim Traore's economic decisions become more important than his speeches. Sovereignty is not strongest when a leader says no to an outside power. Sovereignty is strongest when the country has built enough alternatives that saying no does not bring the entire system to a halt. That distinction matters. Protest can attract attention. Replacement creates leverage. A government can criticize dependency. But unless it develops production, processing, energy, transport, finance, and markets, the dependency simply returns through another door. That is why the next stage of Burkina Faso's transformation is so difficult. Processing requires reliable electricity. Factories need capital. Food needs cold storage and warehouses. Businesses need access to credit. Trucks need roads. Exporters need predictable border procedures. And every one of those systems has to work often enough for investors, farmers, and traders to trust the chain. If one link fails, the value can disappear quickly. A bumper harvest without storage can become waste. A processing plant without reliable power can become an expensive symbol. A factory without customers can become an empty building. So the real test is not whether Burkina Faso can announce more projects. The test is whether these projects begin connecting to one another. If this economic chain were a bridge, which missing piece would you build first? Farms, factories, roads, energy, or markets? That question is more important than it may sound because every answer reveals where people believe Burkina Faso's greatest weakness still lies. And here is the larger turning point. If Burkina Faso can grow more and process more, it still faces one final limit. Its domestic market is only so large. At some point, more production requires more buyers, more factories require more demand, more jobs require more commerce. And that means the next stage of this story cannot remain inside Burkina Faso's borders. The agricultural revolution must become a trade revolution. Because beyond those borders sit Mali and Niger, country facing many of the same pressures, many of the same logistical challenges, and many of the same questions about sovereignty. And if three landlocked Sahel nations begin thinking not as isolated markets, but as parts of a larger economic space, then Burkina Faso's farm policy stops being only a national experiment. It becomes the opening move in a much bigger regional gamble. Burkina Faso's next economic test begins where the national road meets the border. Growing more is one challenge, processing more is another. But if those goods cannot move efficiently into larger markets, the entire strategy can slow down. Burkina Faso is landlocked. So are Mali and Niger for decades. That geography has been treated mostly as a weakness because landlocked economies depend heavily on transport corridors, border procedures, road quality, fuel costs, and access to ports beyond their own territory. But geography can also create pressure to cooperate. That is where the alliance of Sahel states begins to matter economically. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are not yet a fully integrated commercial bloc, and it would be misleading to present them that way. But they have been pushing closer coordination in areas such as industry, commerce, strategic products, and private sector cooperation. The important question is whether that political alignment can become practical trade. Picture a Burkinabe trader loading processed food or agricultural goods onto a truck. For him, sovereignty is not an abstract word. It is the condition of the road ahead. It is the number of hours lost at a checkpoint. It is the paperwork waiting at the border. It is the cost of fuel. It is whether the cargo arrives intact. It is whether a buyer in Mali or Niger can trust that the next shipment will arrive on time. These small details decide whether regional trade becomes real or remains a slogan. If procedures become easier, transport more reliable, and demand more predictable, the consequences can multiply. A farmer gains a larger market. A processor can justify expanding capacity. A transport company can add trucks. A warehouse can hire more workers. A bank may see less risk in financing trade. One functioning shipment can support an entire chain of economic activity. But the opposite is also true. If border friction stays high, if roads remain costly, if insecurity disrupts transport, or if regulations remain inconsistent, then higher production can become a problem instead of an advantage. More harvest without more market can push prices down. More processing without more buyers can leave factories underused. More ambition without logistics can create frustration. That is why the AES economic experiment matters beyond politics. It is a test of whether countries with similar constraints can create enough coordination to turn geography from a barrier into a shared market opportunity. And there is a deeper strategic point here. Burkina Faso does not need to stop trading with the outside world to gain more sovereignty. It needs more options. Regional trade can become one of those options. If producers can sell to neighboring countries, they are less dependent on a single buyer. If processors can reach multiple markets, they gain more room to negotiate. If governments can coordinate strategic goods and transport rules, they begin to build leverage from the ground up. That does not erase dependence. It changes its shape. Every generation inherits a map. The harder question is whether it accepts that map or builds new roads across it. For Burkina Faso, those roads are now economic as much as physical. The country is trying to move from producing for survival toward producing for exchange, from exchange toward scale, and from scale toward bargaining power. But there is an important reason not to declare victory too early. Regional trade figures still show how difficult this transition is. The system is unfinished. Infrastructure remains uneven. Security remains a constraint. Capital remains limited. And political cooperation does not automatically become commercial efficiency. That tension is exactly why this story matters. Burkina Faso is not standing at the finish line. It is standing at the point where ambition must prove it can survive contact with reality. Because if farmers can produce more, processors can add value, and traders can reach wider markets, then the most important result will not simply be higher exports. It will be something harder to measure, but far more powerful: negotiating leverage. And that may be the real reason Burkina Faso's agricultural transformation is becoming a geopolitical story. Trade over aid sounds simple, but its real meaning is much deeper than refusing assistance or turning away from the outside world. Burkina Faso is not trying to prove that it needs nobody. No modern economy works that way. The more serious question is whether Burkina Faso can change the terms of its relationships. Aid begins with a question: what does this country need? Trade begins with a different one: what can this country offer? That difference matters because once a nation produces something others want, the relationship becomes more reciprocal. A buyer needs a supplier. A supplier needs a buyer. Both sides have something to negotiate. For many Africans, that idea carries emotional weight. For generations, countries across the continent have exported raw materials and imported higher value finished products: cotton leaves, clothing returns, cocoa leaves, chocolate returns, minerals leave, machinery returns. The pattern is not identical everywhere, but the frustration is familiar. Africa often produces the beginning of the value chain, while others capture much of the profit at the end. That is why local processing, agricultural productivity, and regional trade can feel like more than economics. They can feel like dignity, but dignity alone cannot sustain a national strategy. Products must still be competitive. Roads must still work. Electricity must remain reliable. Businesses need financing. Institutions must survive political change. And that is where Ibrahim Traore's economic challenge becomes much harder than his political method. The strongest form of sovereignty is not isolation. It is optionality. It is having enough choices that no single partner can dictate every term. A more self-reliant Burkina Faso would still trade with Western countries. It could still work with China, Russia, Gulf states, and African neighbors. The difference would be whether Ouagadougou can approach those relationships with more leverage and less desperation. That is what a successful trade strategy can create: not independence from the world, but more freedom inside the world. For Washington, Brussels, Beijing, Moscow, and regional capitals, that shift would matter. A Sahel country that can feed more of its population, process more of its output, and reach more markets becomes a different kind of negotiating partner. It is harder to pressure a government when that government has alternatives. It is harder to shape a deal when the other side can walk away. And it is easier for Burkina Faso to say yes to cooperation when the agreement genuinely serves national interests. This is the point where trade over aid stops being a slogan and becomes a test of state capacity. Can Burkina Faso build enough productive strength to make choice real? Can it avoid replacing one dependency with another? Can it turn political defiance into durable economic capability? Those are the questions that will determine whether Traore's strategy becomes a model or a warning. Because the final test is not whether Burkina Faso can reject outside pressure. The final test is whether it can still grow stronger after doing so. And that is where the hardest part of this story begins. The hardest part of Burkina Faso's economic transformation begins now, because ambition eventually has to survive the test of ordinary life. Return to the farmer we met at the beginning. The sun is higher now. The field is no longer just a symbol of survival. It represents a national question. 5 years from now, what will success actually look like? Not speeches, not ceremonies, not viral headlines. Success will be measured in whether farmers earn more reliable incomes, whether young people can find productive work, whether processors can compete, whether trucks can move goods safely, and whether Burkina Faso can sell more of what it produces without surrendering too much of the value along the way. That is the scoreboard that matters. If agricultural output rises but processing remains weak, the transformation could stall. If factories are built without reliable electricity, financing, or demand, they can become expensive symbols instead of engines of growth. If regional integration remains political language without easier trade, better roads, and functioning markets, the promise of the AS will remain incomplete. But if those pieces begin to connect, then Burkina Faso could be building something more important than a single successful farm program. It could be building economic choice, not isolation, not independence from every partner. Choice, the ability to decide what to produce, what to buy, what to sell, and which agreements are worth accepting. And that is where Ibrahim Traore's legacy will ultimately be judged, not by how many times he challenged foreign powers, but by whether Burkina Faso becomes more capable after those challenges. Can farms become businesses? Can harvests become industries? Can industries reach markets? Can national pride become durable economic strength? Those are much harder achievements than delivering a defiant speech, because they take years, discipline, institutions, and patience. But they are also the achievements that can change a nation's place in the world. So I want your judgment. Is Burkina Faso building a sustainable economic model, or is the hardest test still ahead? Write your view in the comments. And if you believe Africa deserves to be judged by what it builds, not only by the crises others choose to highlight, share this story with someone who should be part of that conversation. For decades, much of the world has asked what Africa needs. Burkina Faso is trying to ask something different. What can Africa build? What can Africa process? What can Africa trade? And what happens when the answer increasingly belongs to Africans themselves? Because perhaps the most important harvest Burkina Faso is trying to grow is not rice, maize, wheat, or mangoes. Perhaps it is choice. And nations with real choices negotiate their future differently.